Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on the most recent Manbij agreement. Our event is titled The Manbij Agreement, The Way Forward in U.S.-Turkey Relations. My name is Kadir Ustun. I am the Executive Director here at SETA Foundation in Washington. We have a great panel of experts. To my left, there's Ambassador James Jeffrey. He is the Philip Solondz Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. To his left, we have Mark Perry, author and foreign policy analyst. He's the author of more than 10 books exactly, I think, on national security and U.S. military. He's a historian of the U.S. military as well. And to his left, Bassam Barabandi is the Director of External Relations with People Demand Change. We hope to hear from him about the things on the ground, how things are looking on the ground. And to his left is my colleague, Kilic, Kanat, Director of Research here at the SETA Foundation. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, right at the sort of kickoff of the World Cup. We still have a good attendance here. And then in our pre-panel discussion, we were discussing North Korea more than actually the Manbij agreement, but I hope we'll have a great discussion. So there are many things going on around the world, but this issue is very important. It's potentially it's a small step. It looks like a small step, but it can hopefully open up things for the U.S.-Turkey relationship. So we wanted to discuss that this morning. We are going to scramble the lineup here, and we'll start with Bassam. Bassam, why don't you go ahead and tell us how things are looking on the ground, not only in Manbij, around Manbij, but in areas where Turkey intervened, the kinds of things that the local governance models they have built and hope to replicate perhaps in collaboration with the U.S. in Manbij area, and whether it can work going forward. So we want to start with you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Few words about Manbij. Manbij is reflect or give us example exactly the confusion of U.S. policy on Syria. Manbij is a small city. It has it's important for Syrian. I don't know why it's important for United States. They have big problem with Turkey for the last year about who control Manbij and why. Vice President Biden, when he was in Turkey, he's officially promised the Turks that Manbij or SDF would withdraw from Manbij whenever they liberated or cleared it from ISIS, and they couldn't implement that promise till now. Internally and within Manbij, the people are really confused to see who will be controlling of what. Will the American withdraw or they are staying? Will the Turkey come in? And if Turkey will come in, what kind of Turkey is coming in? We have two different kind of Turkish intervention in Syria when it comes to the daily dealing with the Syrian. We have a free model and we have the Forest Shields model, which is two different models. Both of them, Turkey tried to provide some kind of services to show that some kind of services as some kind of stability to show the people, the public that with Turkey, life will be better. They try to send that kind of message. I think the message doesn't go well within the Syrian because, number one, Syria is not Turkey. The mentality of Turkish is different from Syrian. The people that Turkey count on them to do the business in Syria were not qualified. Turkey built 3 hospitals in that part of Euphrates Shields and northern of Idlib in a way, with something like 400 beds, which is the largest in that area in the history of that area. But they don't have doctors to run that hospitals, for example. Turkey tried to build to get this Hawala system or a small bank system in the Euphrates Shields to make the life of people easier. Try to get the electricity into that areas. So they are trying on the service level, but again, we cannot say it's a successful story yet. It's a good story for many reasons. Number one, again, the people that Turkey count on them to run these projects, they were not too much accepted by the people. They tried to get pro-Turkish people to run the project inside Syria. And here we have mixed confusions. Okay, we have some kind of stability, we have kind of services, but are we running our lives? The question was no. So this is mainly the Euphrates shields. Till today, Turkey didn't allow the journalists to come in these areas. I mean, international media, they should come into that area to see it's safe, it's secure, people are happy or not happy. So they can help Turkey to say what they are doing. On the other side, on Afrin, with all understanding of Turkish concern about PKK, the terrorist organization, there's no doubt they are a terrorist organization. They are controlling Afrin. Afrin will always be the center hub for PKK against Turkey for the last 34 years. But the question is, when Turkey come in and liberate the Afrin city, they did, again, Turkish model for Syrian rather than the Syrian, what they hope to see. When we saw that 40,000 of Kurds left the city, I don't think this is a good sign. When we saw that the Islamists, or too much Islamists, right-wing Islamists, they take over the city and they put flyers about the importance of hijab, importance of salat in the city, considered in a way more, I cannot say secular, rather than it's just normal people living there. And then they brought the people of Ghouta to put them in Afrin, and the people of Afrin, they left out. So it's the case Turkey did is very good case for Afrin in the way that we kicked the terrorists out. The day after that, it wasn't that good enough to represent Turkey's success story. So with two models, I think the Americans, as my ambassador and my colleague Mark will talk more about the Americans. The Americans, they are not happy with the kind of relation with Turkey. It's very clear. It's very tense relation. And Manbij, till today, we have deal on paper, we don't have deal on the ground. And there's so many elements in the US government that will take any missteps by Turkey in Manbij to block the deal of Manbij. So do we have the deal? On paper, we have it. Is this deal implemented? We will have to see how this will be, who will fill the gaps, who will run the city, will the local will be there, will the Turkey will bring again a pro-Turkey militia, pro-Turkey people to run the city. That will be disaster. American, again, many people in the administration, they don't feel comfortable with the deal of Manbij. They will use any excuse that Turkey could do in Manbij based on their experience in Afrin and Euphrates shields to tell Turkey this is not a good deal. Let's stop it. We understand that PKK or PYD, they will leave the city. We understand the people, there will be committee between American and Turkey to say who will come from the city. So what the absence are the Syrian. I mean, it's not American job or Turkish job to say who Syrian should come and who Syrian is leave. So the Syrian, definitely they respect Turkey, what it's doing. They appreciate what they are doing. At the same time, they don't understand Turkey. Even we have 3 million Syrian in Turkey, they don't get it well what Turkey wants exactly. Turkey too much focus on the Turkmeni in Syria. The number of Turkmeni, the best estimate is 200,000. And now we are hearing the Turks say that they are 1 million. Say 1 million, they never exist in Syria, 1 million. This conflicting message, it's fire back on Turkey. So Turkey people love Turkey, respect Turkey. Turkey is the big market, big school, big hospital, big space for the Syrian to breathe freely. At the same time, it's, I think, what we hear from the top leaders at the Erdogan office or the foreign minister, very good message, very positive messages. Mm-hmm. But when the people see on the ground, they see completely, not the same message, not different message, but again, not the same messages. So I think in Manbij, we have big challenge. We hope that goes smoothly. We hope that will be stability. In Manbij and Raqqa and Ras Al Ain and these other areas, there are always components that people don't talk about, which is the regime and Iranian. Iran and the regime very close geographically to that area. And they are providing money, they are providing rumors, they try to destabilize the area. We heard many council has been established in the last 2 months. Virtual councils not exist. Ashair, tribal council, military council from Raqqa, from Afrin, from Manbij to say we will fight the Turks, the American, the Kurds, everybody. And we are the locals. We know it doesn't exist. It's just a message from the regime and Iran to the Turks, to the Kurds, to the American, that we will come back and you will leave. And the more Turkey be able to stabilize the area with its component, I think the more this message will fire back. The more we have conflict messages, conflict policies toward these areas, the more people will feel, okay, let's get the regime because the regime will provide something different from the Turks or the Kurds. Kurds, PKK or PYD in the whole region, they are controlling from Manbij, Deir Zor, Raqqa. They didn't do anything for the people. I mean, they have the money. They are not in shortage of money. But as a services, it's zero. It's literally zero. They are spending more money on their own areas. And that goes to Manbij. So many people here, they make research on Manbij and they find out that the people of Manbij prefer Assad to come back because so far we don't have services, we don't have school, we don't have anything. Whereas the regime is sending them the message that, guys, you try everything and everything is failing. We are the best. So we cannot say again on Manbij that we have a deal, we have concrete deal, and this deal will be implemented. I think more challenges is coming on the road rather than more stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Bassam. Well, we want to turn to Mark Perry. We are trying to work on something, a research piece on the American military's approach, perception on the PYD relationship, and hopefully you'll tell us some about that today. How does the U.S. military look at this relationship and the dynamics on the ground as well? Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. All right.
Is this on? Yeah, it is on. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks for being here. I think that there are three ways, I'm just speaking as a reporter now, I think there are three ways to really report on foreign policy if you're sitting in Washington. The first is to pay attention to what the State Department says. The second is to pay attention to what the White House says. And the third is to find out what's going on in the Pentagon. My preferred way of finding out what's going on in foreign policy is to report on the Pentagon and on the military. And what's really interesting about the Manbij situation is the disagreement within the military about what the U.S. ought to be doing in Manbij. It's not normal for me to get phone calls from senior military officers saying, I've got a great story for you. It's often me making 20 or 30 calls and getting one guy to talk to me.
Yeah.
But in March of this year, I received a telephone call from a senior officer at the U.S. European Command saying, are you paying attention to what's happening in Syria? And I immediately thought, this is a guy who's stationed in Europe calling me about what's happening in Syria. The U.S. European Command is in charge of what's happening in Europe, and the U.S. Central Command is in charge of what's happening in Syria. So this was extremely unusual. And there was a tinge of concern and anxiety, almost anger in his voice about the way that the European Command's views on Turkey were being ignored. There was real pressure being put on the U.S. European Command by Turkey, including very quiet kind of sub-rosa threats that what was really at stake in Syria wasn't the war on terrorism or the final outcome in Syria. What was at stake was Turkey's involvement in the NATO alliance, which was endangered by U.S. support for the PKK in Syria. And the argument from the Turks was pretty simple. You said you were fighting the war on terrorism, now you're allied with terrorists who are threatening the sovereignty of Turkey. We take this very seriously, and it puts at issue our relationship with NATO. the commander of NATO at the time, the commander of the European Command, then and now, General Curtis Scaparrotti, was under this constant pressure, came to Washington in March and sat down with Secretary of Defense Mattis, as I reported in an article in the American Conservative, which you should download when you get home, and sat with Mattis and said, you know, Mr. Secretary, we're a little bit concerned about the tensions that are arising within the European Command between us and Turkey, and it really seems to focus on what the U.S. and U.S. Central Command is doing in Syria. And we would like it resolved because the tensions that we're facing could worsen and deepen. And of course, Secretary Mattis reassured General Scaparrotti that this was being dealt with diplomatically and everything would be taken care of. Scaparrotti then appeared before a Senate and House Armed Services Committee and mentioned this very specifically about the growing concerns in EUCOM and in his command about the alienation of Turkey from the NATO alliance and how this had to be dealt with. And I sensed, and I was told in subsequent telephone calls with people in the European Command, that in fact, General Scaparrotti, has a reputation in the military of being a very fine soldier, good combat soldier. He doesn't look like that. He looks like an Oxford professor, but he's the real deal. That General Scaparrotti was quite concerned about it, despite the reassurances from Secretary Mattis, because the Pentagon setup and the U.S. military command setup and the policymaking setup in Pentagon is what is referred to, not surprisingly, as the CENTCOM mafia. That is to say, if you look at the military leadership and the policymaking leadership in the Pentagon, it's Mattis, Dunford. At the White House, it's Kelly, McKenzie, who's the head of the Joint Staff. These are all U.S. Central Command people who have served in the Middle East and not in Europe. So Scaparrotti and the U.S. European Command felt outgunned. They felt that their views on what was happening in NATO with Turkey was a danger to them, not least because the national security strategy of the United States, which came out a month before these complaints, placed Russia and China as the primary challenges facing the U.S. military, and not surprisingly, Manbij wasn't mentioned at all. So Scaparrotti, in his discussions at the Pentagon, would say, I thought that we were focusing on other things here. Now, I know this kind of takes the eye off the ball of Manbij, but if you look at Manbij and you look at this contention between the European Command and the U.S. Central Command, which has now apparently been resolved through the Manbij Agreement, you'll see the real tensions, I think, in American foreign policy between preparing for the challenges of the future of Russia, China, Korea, and the continuing war on terrorism, in which the United States and Syria, by the way, has allied itself with a terrorist organization that's on the terrorism list of the State Department, causing real tensions in the military. Who's saying, oh, wait a second. And if you look at this, at the Manbij Agreement, it really forces you to take a look at the larger picture of the tensions inside the American foreign policy establishment and the growing anxiety that, as I will write in a future article, the growing anxiety that 17 years after September 11th, we still haven't quite gotten the war on terrorism right. And that our policy, which is kinetic and aggressive, has actually deepened the problems we face in the region and not resolved them. Not the least of which that our Air Force, Army, Marines, and Navy have been in the field and our Air Force in the air since 1993, with the subsequent degradation in our readiness and our ability to continue to carry the fight on the war on terrorism at the same time that we're preparing to meet the challenges of Russia and China. This is the, I think, big story of Manbij. It's for me, it has become a kind of an icon of the very sub rosa, very quiet, but very important debate on what now. And in the months ahead, I think that you take a look at Manbij in that context, and you'll begin to understand our relationship, our evolving relationship with Turkey, how and whether we're rebuilding the readiness of our military force, and how we can shape a strategy, which we're supposed to be shaping, to meet the challenges of Russia and China.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that great contextualization of what's happening. We have very few more sort of qualified people than Ambassador Jeffrey to talk about either the U.S.-Turkey relationship or the issues you actually discussed. He was a former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, and he understands the military really well. So, building upon what Mark started that debate as well, can you tell us about what this agreement?
Sure. I'll try to do about 4 things very quickly because I think it's very important to get to the questions here. And first of all, I agree 150% with Mark. I was getting the same calls, but it was not just between 2 commands. At one point, it was, in the end, it was the many people high up basically saying, we can't deal with these guys in the field. We don't know what to, and the reason is that the guys in the field are heroes. Mm-hmm. And they have defeated ISIS. Mm-hmm. This is the first really successful, low-cost, how we should do a war in the Middle East since we started in. Now, all of the political questions that are left open, you're absolutely right. We blundered around without worrying about them. But that's different from blundering around without worrying about the day after with 150,000 troops unsuccessfully. This time we blundered around without thinking of the day after with just a few troops very successfully. So compared to the low standard we have set in the war on terror, this is actually a huge victory. And that's one of the reasons why there was a stickiness. But there's also mirroring the military, which is what kind of forces should we fight with what kind of equipment, A-10s versus F-22s, that debate and such. There's also a diplomatic question. Given the national security strategy of the White House, that is a serious document, and Trump seems to the extent he's taken anything seriously, he actually presented the thing. It's the first time I've seen a president do that. And then more importantly, because it's a better document, the National Defense Strategy of Jim Mattis, we are focusing on near-peer competitors, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and a distant third level extremist terror. And in doing so, the plan is to leverage our alliances with powerful players. Who are those powerful players? They're Turkey. They're Saudi Arabia. They're Israel. They're Japan, South Korea, to the extent we can work it, India, and NATO. But the problem is, you cannot, if you're not going to put a lot of your own skin in the game, American skin in the game, and you're going to rely on the allies, you've got to basically give the allies some leeway and consider their security interests. We, as diplomats, do not like to do that. We want to use, speaking to a foreign country, your infantry, your money, your geography, your risk, but we want to dictate. Now, we've run into this in Manbij. Another place we've run into this is Hodeidah in Yemen. Right now, as we're talking here today, this is playing out. The Saudis existentially and the Emiratis quasi-existentially think that they have to defeat the Houthis. But we're uncomfortable at the way they're doing it because of the humanitarian aspects of it. We believe that Turkey needs to have a secure south in Iraq and Syria, but we're uncomfortable about how Turkey is going about doing that, and there's a reluctance to allow the ally to play a bigger role. Where we are now in Manbij, because Turkey decided it was going to play a bigger role whether the United States wanted it to or not. This is why, and I've been through Manbij seemingly every day since early 2016, this agreement is much more likely to work than the earlier agreements in principle and promises, mainly that the U.S. gave. And here's why. Manbij was critically important strategically for the U.S. as long as there was a serious campaign against ISIS. And that was laid out in the 5 June description by the State Department background briefer who talked at length about why Manbij was so important in 2016. It was the way that ISIS would get in and out of the region. But ISIS is basically defeated, particularly in the part of Syria where the Americans are in the northeast and in Iraq. So it's no longer a major concern. By the same token, for Turkey, Manbij was geographically strategic because in empowering the PYD to be America's infantry in Syria, we're also opening the door to the PYD dominating the entire north of Syria as a threat to Turkey, as an offshoot of the PKK, but also, importantly, cutting off Turkey's access to not so much the Turkomen, and I've experienced that in Iraq too, the Turkomen who are under every, Bush, but more importantly, Turkey's real interests, the Sunni Arabs with whom Turkey has a long-term relationship and needed for its larger policies in Syria. But by moving into Jalabus and Al-Bab, Turkey handled that threat in Euphrates Shield and then handled even more with Afrin. So Turkey is in a much better position vis-a-vis the PYD in Syria today than it was 6 months ago or a year ago because of these operations, and because America is less concerned about the fight against ISIS now than it used to be because it's been so successful. And so now both sides have to focus on the far bigger question: what are we going to do with Syria? And what are we going to do with the Iranians, the Russians, and Assad in this loose coalition that spells nothing good for America, nothing good for Turkey, and nothing good for anybody else around there? That's why the two sides have come together and why I think there's a real chance that they'll succeed. Now, the details of this thing, where the Turkish side has been more open on what was agreed between Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu and Secretary Pompeo, and the American side keeps on coming out and saying, well, there is no timeline. Actually, it's all conditions based. And then people say, yeah, but the Turks are talking about 45 days and then 15 days. And then the American side says, well, that may be, if there were a timeline, it would be something like that. But again, there's a condition. And what you have is some stickiness because of the people on the ground. And this involves the diplomats involved in this as much as the military, who are really committed to the PYD. And the difficulties of getting the PYD to agree to things, because the PYD is the big loser in this particular agreement, but not a real big loser, because the PYD will operate east of the Euphrates, and for the moment, that's not going to be challenged. That's a prediction. That's nothing that Turkey is committed to or the Americans have insisted upon, but I'm pretty sure that that's the reality. President Erdogan made it very clear in his phone call to President Trump, after Trump blithely announced he's pulling out of Syria, that this is the last thing the Turks want. So we've got a growing commonality. The problem is the various steps, whether there's fixed time or conditioned time, are pretty complicated. First of all, they're going to recon who is where, and it's a very, very messy battlefield. Secondly, doing patrols on either side of a demarcation line. They'll set up American patrols and Turkish patrols. That isn't too hard because we already are doing some of that stuff. Then joint patrols together. That's more complicated. Meanwhile, as part of the process, the PYD cadre leave. And then possibly the most complicated is the local military and governance councils, which are mainly Arab, but some Kurd, reflecting not entirely the demographics of the region. The U.S. and Turkey are going to have to figure out what to do with these governance groups, and there's going to be a difference. The U.S. folks on the ground are going to be much influenced by the PYD guys, even if they're across the river. Turkey is going to be influenced by the Free Syrian Army people. It's going to be some of the same problems that we just heard about in Afrin. This can be worked out, but it's going to be complicated and difficult, and there's all kinds of hiccups. The basic hope is that now that senior levels in both governments are committed to this and are moving forward, we will see a success. Again, Manbij is not particularly important strategically. The important thing strategically is for Turkey and the U.S. to be not at odds with each other, but coordinating with each other and building on this to figure out what are we all going to do, not just with Syria, but with Iraq and ultimately with Iran and with the very amorphous role Russia is playing in the region. This is an existential question for Turkey. It's an existential question for the countries in the region, and it has sucked in the United States, whether President Trump wants that or not. So we're in a much better place than we were a few weeks ago, in the sense only that we now are in a better position together, the U.S. and Turkey, and to a certain degree other allies that are out there in the shadows, to deal with the set of most complicating problems that we have in Syria and, again, as I said, in Iraq. So thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Kilic, how does Turkey see this agreement and then the broader picture?
Well, three points about the agreement and why it was important, and 3 points about the potential questions from now on about especially in regards to the implementation. This agreement was it was an overdue agreement, actually, and it created a lot of tension in bilateral relations between Turkey and United States for the last 2-3 years, since 2014 even, that Turkey kept saying that there was a promises that it wasn't kept by the United States. Vice President Biden stated that, Tillerson stated that, but after the Tillerson's visit to Turkey, and even before that, in the phone call between President Trump and President Erdogan, they decided to resolve this in a way that both sides' concerns would be met. And with the roadmap now that was negotiated with the working groups, now we have an agreement. And the agreement, as far as we understand from the meetings in Stuttgart this week, they kind of they reach an understanding about the first step here, which basically includes the force composition, structure of the force, actually, the area of responsibility, distribution of missions, and the methodology of the YPG withdrawal from Manbij. And of course, the timeline. And the second step will be the withdrawal of YPG, and third step will include the establishment of a local administration. And this local administration will have an interim administration. Following that, there will be an election and a council. Why it was important? Well, it was important for Turkey-US relations because the relations came to a point that many people started to consider a total fallout in relations. I think one of the most significant part of this was it shows that diplomatic channels can still resolve the problems. Because of the confusion in both sides and because of the mixed messages coming from the United States, Turkey almost lost its confidence that diplomatic channel or any kind of diplomatic mechanism can resolve this. And this was actually, it shows actually the low threshold, but it shows at the same time great hope on both sides. There's a very cautious, it's cautious, but there's a high optimism in Turkey right now in regards to the future of Turkey-US relations, because it basically fixed a trust issue, and it basically showed that US is committed to its allies, and the fact that both, as Mark stated, the European Command, and following that, the NATO actually made a statement endorsing the agreement, demonstrated that this is an important agreement. This was extremely necessary for the future of NATO as well. And on the Turkish side, what is basically seen as there is a general consensus among the policymakers that if Afrin operation wouldn't take place, this agreement wouldn't be today on the table. So Turkey understands that the boots on the ground makes a huge difference. Boots on the ground is not important only to eliminate the YPG threat on the Turkish border, but it was also important for the making this agreement to work out, making Turkey a more significant actor diplomatically in the resolution of the all over Syria question. And on the Turkey side, another motivating factor that makes this agreement is possible, at least in the Turkish perception, that after this mess in Syria right now, and after the now the fight against Daesh, after the change in the counterterrorism efforts, now Turkey believes that the usability of the non-state actors are now declining. Their capability, their capacity is reaching to a point that after this point, if you want any kind of stabilization effort in Syria, you need nation states over there. And these nation states need to work together, and countries like United States and Turkey, which has a long tradition of working together in different issues, and which still works in places like Afghanistan together for the stabilization effort, have this capacity, have this tradition of working together to resolve some of these problems. So what are the questions right now? The question is, there are multiple questions. One is in regards to the, basically the implementation. That's the biggest question. So there are concerns, the optimism part of Turkey come from this agreement that Turkey and United States agreed on a framework now that they can work together. And the cautiousness comes from the implementation. Because although this is now, it is certain for both sides that this will be implemented, there are so many questions in regards to the implementation. There are technicalities, of course, about the vetting process, about the deciding who is PKK and who is not, and about deciding the local administration, those kind of technicalities. But on the other hand, there are also concerns about, yes, now there is an agreement with NATO and US command, European command and everything, but there is still some concern about CENTCOM, because the Turkish side has been feeling that CENTCOM developed this increasing tightness of relations with YPG. And the fact that when you look at the statements of General Votel or Brad McGurk, who's still responsible for the fight against ISIS, you can see that there is constant glorification of YPG. And Turkish side tries to understand in this implementation process whether this was, a recognition of a success, or whether this is more than a recognition of success, but willingness to continue this partnership in one way or another, which would break the promise of the State Department that this relation is tactical, temporary, and limited. So there is these concerns about the implementation. Second question is about whether Manbij can be a model. So as you may recall, last week, the Foreign Minister of Turkey stated that this could be a model to work with United States in different issue areas in Syria. Well, it can be, there are two parts of this. For Turkey, it can be a model to eradicate the YPG threat alongside the border. So when you look at the border areas of Turkey, especially Suruç, Akçakale, Kızıltepe, Ceylanpınar, Nusaybin, Cizre, these are all Turkish-held areas. On the other side of the border, the area is controlled by YPG. So now,
eastern part of Euphrates.
The eastern part of Euphrates. So for Turkey, this is a concern, and Turkey is, especially in places like Tel Abyad, whose population is, mostly it was the Arabs, which was demographically changed after the YPG controlled the area. It is, can we establish this same system, and can we basically send back the refugees, right, safely to their homes in Tel Abyad, just what Turkey is planning to do in regards to Manbij. And yes, I agree with Bassam's certain points, but for Turkey, Syria problem is also a national security concern. So in regards to the humanitarian side, yes, there are certain steps that will be taken, but of course, Turkey, in regards to its national security, it needs to take certain steps that may not be very favorable at this point with some of the Syrian groups. So that is one part. The second is can we do something, can we use this model and the working group and the roadmaps about the future of Syria? This is a second question, which we need to figure out. And the third is a lesser type of question, but when you look at Wes Mitchell's latest statement and testimony, you will see that Wes Mitchell in multiple different instances stated that Turkey can be an important partner in counterbalancing both Iran and Russia. So this is the expectation. Turkish side is now curious about what would be the expectations of the United States from Turkey in regards to not at this point Russia that much, but Iran on the ground, considering that Secretary Pompeo just released a new Iran policy or strategy or demands from Iran. And Turkey is at this point curious about what would be the US demands from Turkey in regards to a policy towards Iran. That would be the last question that needs to be dealt with. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kilic. I want to collect questions from
Just
the
if you-
audience.
to allow me.
I do have some questions as well.
No, just
Sure.
Here we
just
go.
to join what the ambassador said and Kulik said. Again, when the American and the Turks announced reaching to an agreement, I talked with senior level with SDF guy, and I asked him, what do you think about this deal? He said American is close allies. They have bad relation with Turkey, and now they are trying to improve their relations, and we have no problem on that. And I asked him, where your forces? Are they still in Manbij? He said, no, we start withdraw 3 days before, and on Thursday they start withdrawing their forces before announcement was on Monday. And I asked him, then what you will do with the regime now? He said, the Americans are pushing us to go, or encouraging us to go and negotiate with Damascus directly. I said, negotiate about what exactly? I mean, the American forces are there.
Yeah.
What you are negotiating with the regime? Say anything, we have to negotiate with the regime to secure our future. And I asked him what the American offered to you. They say the only offer to us is to join Geneva process, to be part of the negotiation and part of final solution of Syria. So I mentioned this to tell the message behind that communication, that even though the United States always say that we have no much influence on SDF, this is not true. Whenever the United States want to have leverage on SDF, it's the only leverage they have is on Syria is on the SDF. And SDF know exactly that without the United States, they are nothing, zero. I understand the chain of command is well structured with SDF, but without the American Air Force, they are just like any other Syrian militia. So when Americans say they did a great job, they did a great job, but because of the American full support of them. So not because they are extraordinary. And the most important thing, they are communist structures. So it doesn't work.
Interesting.
They don't hide it. They say we are communist structures. And I don't see how this works here and there. From other side, when we talk about with Turkey, when you talk about Turkey is a very important player, but I don't think they are matching what the American wants. So there's big misunderstanding, mismessaging between Turkey and the United States. We put it with what Mark said about CENTCOM way of doing business. I think, again, Turkey, Manbij could be a model if Turkey did the right things in Manbij, because the minister, he mentioned that after Manbij we go to Raqqa. And after Raqqa, we go to Al-Abyad. And the president of Trump, he said, we are leaving Syria. So we have a vacuum that could be good model for implementing a new Syria, and maybe the opposite, to be disaster. The Kurds till today, PYD, it's not the Kurds, PYD, they are still playing on the cards with Russian, Iran, regime, Turkey. I understand last year that the Turkey offered to the Americans some kind of compromise on SDF, that we have no problem to work with the Kurds. Our problem not with the Kurds. Our problem is with PKK specifically. And we can't work with the Syrian Kurds the way we work with KRG in Iraq. And the answer was no, we need our own Kurdistan, and the Americans say we have no influence. This is what the Kurds told us. So whenever the Americans won't use their leverage, they can use their leverage. But the problem is for them, it's not clear who's who in the administration in charge. We don't know what they are ending game for them. Dealing with Turkey is very important. We cannot blame Americans for the chaos they have in DC, but again, we have to think, Turkey should think it wise about what they are doing in Syria. To have successful story, to have the model in Afrin that can go, or in Manbij that go to other parts of Syria.
Yeah, the encouragement of the PYD to work deals with Syria, I've heard stuff about that from various sources. It's another one of those things that has not been fully vetted within the U.S. government. The U.S. Congress and the Defense Appropriation Bill just blocked $300 million to the SDF until the U.S. government can explain what it is trying to do there. And so there's still this, it's partially what you said, Mark, about the various priorities. It's also partially, there's all kinds of ideas on how we can contain Iran,
Right.
and how at the same time we can get out of Syria, which would seem to be contradictory goals. And the secret sauce is one or another somebody who will help us with our containing Iran. The Russians play that role, the Syrian government plays that role, and we're not the only ones doing it. The Jordanians and the Israelis are doing this too. This is an extremely complicated battle zone.
So at the same time, when U.S. is the main ally for SDF, SDF is selling the oil to the regime
Right.
to use it in the machine war to kill the Americans. It doesn't fit, but this is the reality. I mean, the oil is being used to refinery, then they send it to the tanks, and the tanks is just near Deir Zor in Tanaf. And these forces are trying to attack the American forces, and we saw 2 or 3 incidents. So the same SDF that the only allies for the United States in Syria is selling the oil to the U.S. enemies to kill the American soldiers.
During the American Civil War, Henry Halleck went to Abraham Lincoln and said, "You're going to appoint Ulysses S. Grant to head the armies? He drinks." And Lincoln said, "Yeah, but he fights." And, you know, this is an uncomfortable relationship that we have with people on the ground. But, you know, remember that in, when was it, 2013, 2014, we had supported moderate Syrians. We spent, what, $350 million building a moderate Syrian force of, what, 5 guys who deserted? And it was embarrassing, and it was a failure, and it looked like a defeat, and so we picked people who were there.
So
That's why we're here.
So my point from this, that the Jazeera area in Syria, Raqqa, Deir Zor, Hasaka, is the only area that's still outside the regime. It could be a successful story for Syrian revolution, the Syrian people over there. The tricky thing is how the United States and Turkey will deal with the Kurdish questions away from PKK. PKK, definitely they will be defeated, they will be out of this game. But then we have a huge number of Kurdish who are living there and Arab who are living there, that from one hand they have more affiliation, sympathy with Turkey as Sunni, as neighbor. At the same time, United States is the superpower. So if Turkey should be more rational in dealing with this issue, and United States should be more realistic to dealing with this issue. So even if United States withdraw, any other forces fill the gap, we will have some kind of stability to counter Iran, Russia, and the regime. Otherwise, they are there. I mean, the regime is just 10 kilometers from Raqqa today.
That's the important thing of this roadmap is probably the most significant side is both sides recognize the significance of stabilization after this point. Because so far, I guess, the main divergence of the perspectives between United States and Turkey was, for United States, it could be a counterterrorism issue or an issue of Middle Eastern geopolitics instead of countering the Iranian threat or the Russian influence in Middle East. But from the Turkish side, it was a country that has become a failed state, 600 kilometers of border, that can export any kind of insecurity to Turkey.
Yeah, true.
And for Turkish side, it was not only defeating ISIS, but rehabilitating the country, create a reconciliation process, and if possible, a reconstruction process, because it is costing Turkey dearly in terms of economy and sociology as well. So the perspectives were a little different, but after the defeat of ISIS, I guess, both sides can agree on the significance of stabilization, and that would be a common denominator from now on. So when we are saying that this process can be a model, maybe it can be model in terms of if the Manbij stabilization is successful, providing stability and security in other areas as well. And it doesn't need to be only in northern Syria, but all over Syria.
Inshallah.
Well, thank you. I'm still going to continue to restrain myself from asking questions and turn to the audience. Please. one here. I want to collect a few questions so we save time.
Yeah, hi, Dan Lieberman. Yeah, there's still something I don't understand. That Syria is a sovereign country, and the Assad regime with Russia seems to have stabilized the situation. At least they reduced the violence. And it would seem that the U.S. and Turkey are really establishing a state within a state, something which I think is illegal and contrary to international law. And it would seem to me only creating more conflicts for the future. So I don't see why the Syrian sovereignty is not respected and what Turkey and the United States aim to get out of this in the end.
Who do you direct your question to?
To everyone.
I'll take it.
Yes, please.
Well, let's collect a couple more if you have questions. Yes.
Hello, Wright Smith. Thank you so much for a great panel. Are there any specific instances that you can point to where Kurds who are either armed or trained by the United States were connected in some way to PKK attacks in Turkey?
And that's probably directed
Probably.
against
Kilic.
Yes.
Kilic, yes. Any other questions? Well, I have one. I want to add that Ambassador and Mark, something seems to have changed. You talked about it, Ambassador. It's no longer that strategic in terms of defeat of ISIS. Is that the kind of game changer in, I mean, we had an event here, you were speaking, we said US, allies at odds, we have serious problems, we talked about it in detail. But is that Trump, something has changed along the way for somehow on the US side to, let's look at this a bit more differently. Is that Turkey complained enough or intervened? How do you see, these are all probably contributing factors, but is there a significant sort of point where, we just can't do it this way?
Yeah.
That's my question, and then maybe you can address this
Okay.
sovereignty question.
And I think on your last question, I think we all have views. One is, by and large, Turkey had the better arguments always in Manbij. But these arguments were not getting through to the top for the reasons you said. First of all, because when you play the fighting terrorism card in the United States post 9/11, it is very hard to move people in the field if they're playing that card, and they were playing that card very aggressively. But that card has largely dissipated because we've been so successful. And that's one reason why, in looking at how Trump kind of exploded when he was presented with $200 million to pay for, rebuilding Northeast Syria. And he was told, yeah, we got to stay on there long term because, to defeat ISIS. He said, wait, I thought I announced we defeated ISIS 6 months ago. And so the fact that we were so successful with ISIS reduces the need to do that. Secondly, Turkey basically upped the pressure significantly, both diplomatically and militarily, going into Afrin. We have to remember that for 3 years, Turkey pounded this drum of you're fighting terrorists with other terrorists. We've all heard everybody from President Erdogan on, and I'll say it. At the same time, where were we providing the air support for these terrorists? Out of Incirlik Air Base, A-10s, until December of last year. When we sent them away, not because the Turks told us to go away, but because we didn't really need them anymore. And so Turkey was basically helping and facilitating our operations in many ways against ISIS because it was also an interest of Turkey. So Turkey was conflicted on this. But then with the Afrin operation and with the new administration, Turkey got a lot more attention. It started with Tillerson, but then after Tillerson left, you had this period of vacuum with no Secretary of State. Bolton was replacing McMaster, who also understood it from his contacts with Ibrahim Kalin. And so you had this period of time that everybody adjusted, and people said, wait a second, Turkey A has a point. We've been promising them for 2 years. Why do we care about Manbij? We don't need the SDF as much as we used to. And Turkey is really important for these various other things. In terms of Syria, on the surface, you've got a point, but here's the problem. First of all, there is a UN resolution 2254 that essentially states that it is the belief of the international community, and specifically the Security Council, that the current Syrian regime is a security problem for its own people, some 400,000 who have been killed mainly by the regime until people stopped counting about 6 months ago, has used chemical weapons many, many times in violation of many agreements, including the one we work with the Russians, has generated refugee flows and internally displaced people flows of over 10 million, including 3.5 million to Turkey, over 1 million to Europe, destabilizing still today many of the governments of our NATO partners in Europe, generated the creation of ISIS, which then swept into much of Iraq, and currently is, with the connivance of the Syrian government, hosting Iranian and Hezbollah power projection against Israel, including the drone flight and a rocket attack on the Golan Heights a few weeks ago. So this is a security concern for the United States, for Jordan, for Iraq, for Turkey, for Israel, for Saudi Arabia, for the whole region. And the United States is going to remain involved in Syria, along with many other countries, until they are convinced that there is a future for them and for Syria that doesn't make Syria a extremely serious threat to them. That's why Turkey is in there. It's why the United States, one or another farm is in there. It's why Israel is in there. It's why, in various ways, the Gulf states are also working to try to find a solution to Syria. This has diplomatics through the UN. It has military through presence and operations. And it has reconstruction, mainly in the terms of there ain't going to be any reconstruction, at least not from the West, until the security situation is worked out. And it hasn't been worked out yet. That's really reality. It has nothing to do with international law. There's a threadbare argument under international law given 2254, but the main reason is we're talking about existential beliefs that their existence is threatened in the case of at least Turkey and Israel, and to some degree other countries in the region from Syria.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mark, your thoughts on this? On my question as well.
80% of the U.S. military voted for Donald Trump. 80% of the people in uniform voted for Donald Trump. And according to Military Times, they voted for Donald Trump because they were really tired of a military strategy that included the two words that they hate, nation building. That's why they voted for him, because they thought not that he'd, not use the military and he was a pacifist. They voted for him because they wanted to use the military for military purposes. And that's kind of a background for Joe Votel's statement that, kind of hinted that when Trump said we're going to get out of Syria. Votel was at the House Armed Services Committee, and he didn't disagree with that. And then 6 days later, because of concerns over Manbij, he said, well, we've got to stay in Syria because of our goal there is stabilization. Now, if you want to mention a word to the military that will make their skin crawl, it's the word stabilization. And that's why we're having such a hard time to determine exactly what the U.S. strategy is in Syria. Well, to keep Iran in check, okay. To keep Russia in check, okay. I think you could say that. To defeat ISIS, they're defeated. Stabilization, what's that? And you hear this in the military a lot, real debates about what we're doing, why we're doing it, is it working, what constitutes victory, and after victory, what next? Somebody tell me how this ends, is kind of the question. That's my non-answer to your question.
Well, I'll take it. Kilic,
Bassam, you want to add something? No. Okay. Just to say a few words about the situation in Syria. Actually, me and Kadir were in Kilic before the Euphrates Shield operation. And the day that we were in Kilic, when we were waiting for an appointment with the mayor of Kilic, Kilic is a town in the border with Syria. And that day, the appointment was canceled because there was a rocket attack from the other side of the border to Turkey, Kilic. And 6 people died that day. So, and when the Afrin operation started, Olive Branch operation, we see the similar things, that from the hills of Syria, there were constant Katyusha rockets falling on the Turkish side. So it is basically, it became, like when it became a failed state, it started to export every kind of insecurity to the region. And Turkey followed an open door policy for the refugees, and it paid dearly for that. And Turkey faced ISIS threat for, between July 2015 to July 2000, even December 2016, Turkey had like 20-25 ISIS attacks. And it is the attacks to the major city centers, major transportation hubs, airports, the biggest nightclub, and everything. So when it becomes an exporter of insecurity, I guess, that kind of operation becomes necessary. And you wouldn't talk about a sovereign state that's kind of, trying to control the border, when that state is not controlling the border anymore. And in regards to YPG, PKK issue, it's kind of, it has become an often asked question, and the answer is always similar. This is the similar organizations, share the similar ideology, similar leadership, similar type of governance structures, and even similar type of human pool. So when you look at the composition of YPG, you will see that there are a lot of PKK recruitment that work for YPG in Kobani, in Haseke, and in other regions. So when Turkey approaches to this problem, it doesn't, there is no reason to create an artificial distinction because YPG is kind of, in Syria and PKK is in Turkey. And considering the biggest concern, and especially this will be a question, the next question for Turkey-US relations, because one of the promises that US made at the very beginning of its support for YPG was United States will recollect the weapons that it gave to YPG after the end of the ISIS operations. So this is a concern that now an armed and trained group of YPG members, what will be the next step for them? How they will be rehabilitated, or how they will be controlled by the US, which is planning to withdraw from Syria, according to some. So this is the biggest concern for Turkey, and this will be a major issue, I guess, following the Manbij agreement for between Turkey and US relations.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Mark, you were shaking your head about this recollection thing.
I can't wait to see the collection of weapons.
Yeah.
I look forward to that day.
Turkey has feeling exactly the same way.
That's never going to happen. Sorry.
Why not?
It's just,
Well, I think that
we need to be realistic about what the expectations are here, and I don't think it's realistic to expect that we're going to disarm our allies in Syria. Just not going to happen. Why would we do that?
So the question is,
when are we going to do it? Next
where
year?
the promise come
Tomorrow? Tuesday? Come on.
No, the question is now then, what was that promise about?
The promise was to get to next week.
I just want to answer. I will add what the ambassador said about Syria. And, in 1999, I think, 1989, Syria and Turkey, they have signed an agreement, Adana Agreement.
1999.
Adana Agreement, where the Syrian regime, the full sovereign regime, allowed Turkey forces to come inside Syria 20 kilometers to fight the terrorists who are PKK, who are founded by Hafez Assad. And Ojlan is Hafez Assad baby. He brought him, he gave him the passport, he gave him Lebanese in Buqaa Valley, the camps, and they have been trained. He was living in Damascus. His forces was moving. Yes. Sorry, what I'm saying that when you talk about sovereign state, legally I understand what you are saying, but there should be practice to prove you are a sovereign state. Hafiz Assad, he brought Öcalan from day one. He gave him all the facilities in Beirut, in Lebanon, Buqa Valley, in Damascus.
In Kobani.
Then in Kobani, I don't know about Kobani. Then he used PKK against Turkey for something like from 1983 or 79 till 1999. At that deal, and Adana deal, Assad, with the full sovereignty of Syria, with his peak of power, he gave the Turkish the authority to go inside Syria 20 kilometers to fight the terrorist PKK that he was built. So legally, your question might make sense. In reality, it doesn't make sense, sorry. I mean, from that example of Öcalan, not the rest of events that Security Council, Hezbollah, Iran, Qaeda, Nusra, everybody was in Syria now. Thank you.
Well, one last question then. What is the potential spoiler in this process going forward in terms of U.S.-Turkey cooperation? I mean, we have Russia, who may not necessarily be happy about this kind of
What could go wrong, right?
Well,
That's what you're asking.
among many other, what could go wrong?
Well, on the larger Syrian thing, almost anything. In fact, the easier question to answer is,
In terms of U.S.-Turkey cooperation being broadened potentially, if it works, let's say, in
well,
Manbij.
it first has to work in
Yeah,
Manbij, and
yeah.
the two problems with that will be the local people on both sides will report back to their chains of command to Washington and Ankara. The other side is being difficult. The other side isn't living up to the agreement. The other side won't talk to us. The other side isn't returning our calls. The other side didn't show up at the checkpoint when they were supposed to. And then you have to have a spirit of trust and compromise at the highest levels, certainly at the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and counterparts in Turkey levels, so that people can say, okay, look, we'll fix this. What's of the 12 irritants you've just told me, what are the two you want me to try to fix right now? Okay, there we'll fix them. And then the next 10, next week they're arguing about that. But meanwhile, they move forward. But if one of the other side says, okay, this is just violation and we just can't live with this anymore, and there's a blow up, that's where this thing will derail. But the Turkish and U.S. governments have a long history of working these things out quiet. Well, there's a lot of loud rhetoric on both sides, but the quiet working of them out is a fairly established custom. So I think that Manbij will probably go all right, but there'll be lots of news stories, there'll be lots of accusations in the media, but it'll probably go all right. The bigger set of questions that we've talked about today involving Syria as a whole, nobody knows where this is going.
All right. Well, thank you. Mark?
Well, I think it's important to note that when Curtis Scaparrotti, the head of EUCOM, came to the Pentagon to talk to Secretary of Defense Mattis about his relationship with Turkey and the difficulties in that relationship because of what was going on in Syria, the Secretary of Defense said, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, we're taking care of it. And it turns out that was right. They were taking care of it. There, before June 4th, there was a recognition on the part of the Pentagon and on the part of the State Department that something needed to be done. This wasn't Trump's trip to Singapore. This was the way diplomacy was supposed to be handled. Quiet, hi, how are you? Would you like a cup of coffee? What's your problem? Maybe we can do this. Let's try this. How about this? You have a calendar. We don't have a calendar. Is that all right? You can say this statement. We'll say this statement. We'll kick it down the road, but we agree. I mean, it was really quite good, I thought. And it gives me faith. Faith is something you believe in that you know isn't true. But it gives me faith that the U.S.-Turkish relationship is actually on fairly firm ground, and that's because we've had decades of working with them inside of NATO, and Manbij symbolizes a lot of things, but also I think symbolizes the depth of the relationship and the willingness of both parties to work things out.
Thank you, Mark.
I don't, personally, I don't see the American-Turkish relation in Syria or regarding Syria will be fruitful anytime soon. I don't see there will be any positive results rather than the media shake hands, this kind of stuff. But in reality, on the ground, I think we have two countries, allies in the NATO, allies in democracy, free market, economy, and this kind. On Syria, they are completely, till today, I see them go in completely two different ways and very fast. Manbij, if it works, it could be the starting point to build the trust, not the building trust. It will be a small step toward building trust, at least in Syria, and even this, I don't see it happening. There's need a lot of change from both sides that I don't think both of them are willing at this time to do it toward each other.
If it really comes down to it and the U.S. is faced with a really angry ally that's in NATO and says it's us or it's the PKK, guess who we're going to choose?
Yeah.
Yeah. Kilic?
I'll be second to Mark here. If the question is only Manbij, yes, if the agreement fails, the relations may fall apart. But I guess the Manbij agreement is more than a Manbij agreement. So it is about the future of U.S.-Turkey relations. It is the future of the NATO alliance and the role of Turkey in this alliance. And it is for the future of U.S. trust and commitment, U.S. confidence of the U.S. allies to United States. So when you put those in perspective, you can say that yes, it was a very small step considering the huge geography of the Syria and the issues like taking back the weapons and ammunitions, all of these things. There may be a lot of minefields, there may be a lot of speculation, provocation, there may be public diplomacy accidents on the road. We can see the picture of another US official with some YPG leaders, which would create a public outburst in Turkey. All of these things can happen. This will be the road, in the road. But the fact that both sides come together and try to solve the Manbij problem, not because of the Manbij, but because of the future of US-Turkey alliance, I think that is
I think it's
important.
very dangerous to relate Manbij to the Turkish-American relation.
I think that's
too much.
It is dangerous. No, it is dangerous, but it is, I told you in my initial remarks that threshold is really low, that even that a small step, a confidence building measure such as Manbij can make a huge difference for the future.
Yeah. If I may add, Manbij is kind of the culmination of a 2-3 year tension, that started with the Kobani and what happened afterwards. It even triggered something that Turkey hasn't really done, intervene in a couple of, now you have Turkish-controlled areas. So for the Turkish side, it's been so serious that, we started reading a lot of stuff about the whole alliance being questioned. But you're right. I mean, it has many different aspects. It can't be reduced to Manbij.
Exactly.
But it does signify a lot more than Manbij. I would agree with that. But this has been a great discussion. Thank you very much for all coming. Please join me in congratulating our panel. Thank you.